Masechet Baba Batra, Daf, Pe Bet, Higdilu lo Yeshapeh. The Mishnah taught that in a case where someone buys just 2 trees, then he only gets the trees and does not own any of the land. The seller keeps the ownership of the land. That has a number of consequences. Number one, if the tree grows tall and then it's spreading shade on the ground, the owner of the ground cannot go and say, hey, you're covering my ground. I want to grow things and your trees are blocking my sunlight. I want to cut down the trees. He cannot do that because he knows that he sold the trees and therefore he's giving over also all the rights that he has to the sunlight that the trees will block. That's built in to the sale. He's giving away the trees. Obviously, the trees are going to block out some light onto his ground, and so that's included in the sale. Furthermore, anything that grows from the trunk of the tree belongs to the owner of the tree. Anything that grows from the roots of the tree, since the roots are down under the ground, therefore that belongs to the owner of the ground, the seller. And now the Gemara wants to ask, how do we distinguish between what grows out of the trunk and what grows out of the roots? I mean, they really just flow into each other. So how do you determine? That's the first question. How do we know what's growing out of the trunk, and how do you know what's growing out of the roots? Rabbi Yochanan has a simple answer. Rabbi Yochanan, Kol shero'eh penei chama zehu min hageza, v'she'eno ro'eh penei chama zehu min hashorashin. Anything that can see the face of the sun, meaning anything that's visible above ground, that's called as growing out of the trunk. And the owner of the tree gets that. Whereas anything that is not facing the sun, meaning it's down underground, it's concealed, you can't see it from above ground, that's considered part of the roots. Okay, easy answer. But now we have a worry that if we're going to give to the owner of the tree anything that comes out of the trunk, you might have a case where there's something growing down at the bottom of the trunk near the ground. And so, okay, fine, the owner of the tree owns it. But over some time, there might be some sediment, some dirt that piles up and covers over that spot that this branch connects to the trunk. And then it will actually look like, from above, it'll look like another tree. And then the owner of the trees will say, oh, look, I bought 3 trees from you. Because look, I want the 2 that I actually bought. And then there's a third one growing, and it's growing out of the ground. And you can't see that it's actually connected to the trunk. Now, it does belong to him, that branch, but it's just a branch, not a separate tree. But over time, it will look like a separate tree if the ground gets raised up a little bit. And then he'll be able to trick the seller and then say, look, I bought 3 trees. And if he buys 3 trees, then he owns all the ground underneath the 3 trees as well. So Rabbi Yochanan's criteria is going to lead to people stealing and tricking and making all kinds of mistakes. Rather, what the Mishnah actually means, when the Mishnah says that anything that grows out of the trunk belongs to the tree owner, yes, it belongs to the tree owner, but he can't leave it there. He has to cut it down. And then that branch he can use for himself. He can use it to burn, or to build, whatever he wants to use it for. But he can't leave it there because that will lead to this worry. And so even Rabbi Yochanan would agree, both Rav Nachman and Rabbi Yochanan agree that he cannot leave it there, he has to cut it down. Amar Rav Nachman, Nikitinan dekel en lo geza. Rav Nachman has a tradition, just a 4-word tradition. It says a palm tree has no trunk. Now, this is difficult to understand, but don't worry, we're going to bring 2 interpretations. Sabad Rav Zavid lemamad, en lo geza leba'al dekel, techevan de lemechpar ulsharesh ka'e asuche masach da'ate. And Rav Zavid explains what Rav Nachman's tradition means is that someone who buys a palm tree does not have a right to the roots that grow from the trunk of the palm tree. Even though our Mishnah just said that someone who buys 2 trees, he buys also the rights of the roots that grow out of the palm trees. Rav Papa is going to ask about that. Okay, but anyway, that's Rav Zavid, that's how he explains the law. Now, why? What's the difference between a palm tree and any other tree? Because a palm tree stands ready to be dug up and uprooted, so the one who buys the palm tree does not have the roots in mind. What that means is that a palm tree, unlike other trees, as we saw in an earlier daf, if you prune them, them, you cut the tops, they will grow more. But a palm tree, if you cut it down, if you prune it, it will not grow more. And therefore, someone who buys a regular tree is thinking of the new growths that's going to keep coming up with. And so he has in mind all the new growths, including the shoots that come from the trunk. But with a palm tree, he's having in mind he's going to take the dates of the palm tree for as long as it lives, and then eventually it will die, and then that's it. He will just take the tree with him, and he doesn't have a right to replant a new tree. And therefore, a palm tree, he's not thinking of the new growths of any part of the tree, including the trunk, and so he's not thinking of the trunk, the shoots that grow out of the trunk, and therefore the seller keeps the shoots that grow out of the trunk. That's Rav Zavid's explanation of Rav Nachman. מתקיף לה רב פאפא, והקונה שני אילנות, דלמחפר ולמשרש קיימי, וקטנה דיש לו גזע. Rav Papa challenges Rav Zavid from our Mishnah, because our Mishnah says that if someone buys 2 trees, and 2 trees also stand to be dug up and uprooted, because if I buy 2 trees, I don't own the ground, and so therefore, eventually, they're going to die, all trees die, and then I can't replant them. Instead, I'm going to just uproot the trees, and that's it. And so fundamentally, any other trees and palm trees are the same. Okay, it's true. Maybe regular trees, you can prune it will grow, and prune it more, it will grow, but eventually it's going to die, and then I'm going to take the trees with me. And yet, the Mishnah says that regarding regular trees, and the Mishnah makes no distinction. So all trees, the buyer of the 2 trees gets what grows out of the trunk. Even though once the tree dies, he will take the trees and will not replant them. So just like regarding regular trees, even though they're going to die and is going to remove the tree, nevertheless, in the meantime, while it's alive, if it grows shoots, he wants to have the shoots. So too regarding a palm tree, even though it's not going to regrow another tree, it's not going to regrow branches either, nevertheless, he has in mind that while the palm tree is there, he wants to have whatever shoots might grow from the trunk, he wants to have them in mind. What's the difference? Both types of trees eventually die, and both types of trees, Mishnah says, you get the shoots from the trunk in the meantime. And therefore, Rav Papa offers a different interpretation. Ela ma Rav Papa, en lo geza lebal dekel, lefi she'en mosi geza. Rav Papa agrees with Rav Zavid's interpretation of the law, but gives a different reason for it. So here too, he says what Rav Nachman meant is that someone who buys a palm tree does not have a right to the shoots that grow out of the trunk. Why? Because palm trees generally do not have any shoots that grow out of the trunk. It's very unusual. And therefore, the one who buys the palm tree is not thinking about, I'm buying the palm tree and I'm thinking about any shoots that are going to grow out of the trunk. It doesn't have it, so therefore he's not thinking about it. So if it should happen that some shoots grow, then the seller gets to keep them. This is unlike other trees that generally do have roots that grow out of the trunk, and so in those cases, the buyer has it in mind, and that explains why the Mishnah says yesh lo geza, but that will not apply to a palm tree that generally does not have any shoots growing out of the ground. So Rav Papa is very easily explainable according to the Mishnah. So now we go back to Rav Zavid. Well, Rav Zavid, Kashya Matitin, Rav Zavid, how will you explain the Mishnah, since you interpreted the case of Rav Nachman to be about palm trees, but not the reason is because palm trees die, but all trees die, and then that's it. Once they die, then you cannot replant them. So the shoot, which is like a little new tree, so you can't have a new tree there anyway. There should not be any difference between the Mishnah and palm trees, and the Mishnah says you can get the shoots, and you explained Rav Nachman as no shoots. So how can you explain the Mishnah? And Rav Zavid says, I have an answer. The Mishnah is actually talking about a case where the guy who buys the 2 trees is buying them for a certain amount of time, let's say for 5 years. Now that means 2 things on both ends. Number 1, if he buys a tree and it lasts a long time, it lasts 10 years, he only gets to take the fruits for 5 years, and then that's it, he gives it back to the seller. On the other hand, let's say the tree dies after, let's say, 2 years. That means the guy who I bought rights to use 2 trees for 5 years. This only lasted 2 years. Therefore, he has a right to replant other trees. That's what the Mishnah is talking about. So when the Mishnah says that the purchaser has a right to the shoots that grow out, that's because he has a right to also replant. Those two things go together. I have a right to replant. These shoots are like a little new tree, so he has in mind a new tree if this one should die, and therefore he has in mind he's also buying the shoots from this tree. That's what the Mishnah is talking about. However, Rav Zavid explains, when Rav Nachman gave his law about the palm trees, that was talking about an indefinite sale, where I buy, let's say, 2 palm trees, and so I don't have in mind that I'm ever going to be able to replant anything, and so since I don't have in mind replanting, I also don't have in mind that I'm going to take the shoots that grow out of the trunk, and so Rav Zavid can explain his interpretation of Rav Nachman and reconcile it with the Mishnah. Kana shelosha kana karka. Back to the Mishnah, it says if you buy 3 trees, then you get the land underneath the tree as well. Question, vechama, how much of the land precisely? Amar Rabbi Chiya bar Abba Amar Rabbi Yochanan, hareze kana tachtehen ubenehen vechusa lahen kimlo ore vesalo. Someone who buys 3 trees will acquire the trees themselves, of course, but also directly beneath the trees and all the land that's between the trees and even the space surrounding the trees, enough space for a gatherer of figs and his basket. In other words, not only do I own all the land under the trees, everything between them, if they're a little bit spaced apart, so you get that whole area, but you have to service the trees and be able to collect the figs. And so you need someone to be able to walk around the trees and to reach up and get the figs and put them in his basket. So however much that is, a couple of feet surrounding the perimeter of the trees, also he gets. That's Rabbi Chiya's opinion. Matkif la Rabbi Elazar, hashta derech en lo, ore vesalo yesh lo, derech en lo dar'a acharitihi, ore vesalo yesh lo. Rabbi Elazar, the Amorah, challenges Rabbi Chiya, and he says it doesn't make sense that the buyer should get extra space all around the trees, because look, after all, the buyer doesn't even get a pathway. If I buy 3 trees from you, fine, I get the trees and the area under the trees, but then I have to secure a pathway to get there. We're going to ask a question in a minute about Rabbi Akiva's opinion that someone who sells generously, is that reconcilable with this or not? But for now, all right, we're assuming that someone who buys these 3 trees and the land does not get a pathway. So if he doesn't get a pathway, then do you think he gets an area for the gatherer and the basket? A pathway he doesn't get because it's another land. If I bought this specific piece of land within your field, I only get that, and I don't get any other land, and that means, and I don't get the pathway. So just like I don't get the pathway, so too, and the pathway is necessary because I need it to get there. So all the more so, I'm not going to get extra land surrounding the trees so that I can go and gather them. If I want that land, I have to purchase it separately or rent a right to use it, same as with a path. So that's the machloket between Rabbi Chiya and Rabbi Elazar. Rabbi Chiya says you do get the surrounding area, and Rabbi Elazar says you don't get the surrounding area, just like you do not get a pathway. Now this has some consequences. Amar Rabbi Zera, midibrei Rabbeinu nilmad. Rabbi Zera says, from the words of Rabbi Elazar, we can derive something else. Shelosha hu de'en lo derech hashenayim yesh lo, damar le bar adidach kaimi. We can learn that when someone buys 3 trees, that's when he doesn't get a pathway. But if you only buy 2 trees, paradoxically, you do get a pathway because the buyer can say, I am standing on your land. My trees are on your land. And obviously, I need to get to the trees, so I have to have a pathway. In other words, there's a kind of a paradox here. When I buy 3 trees, I get 100% of the right to the land under the trees. But that is also a limitation. I only have a right to that land and not any other. And therefore, I have to buy a pathway. Whereas when I buy 2 trees from you, it's obvious that I am not getting any of the land at all. Well, I'm not getting any of the land, but I have the 2 trees. So implicit within the sale of the 2 trees is the right to get to the trees. It has to be included. So I own, when I buy 2 trees, I own 0% of the land, but I do own the right to use the land for the service of the trees to get there and whatever else I would need to do. for the trees is included. But if I buy 3 trees, the land is included underneath, but that's it. Oh, you want other land besides that? That you have to get separately. So that's what we can see from Rabbi Elazar's opinion. Amar le Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak le Rava. Lema Rabbi Elazar le dishmoel Rabbe. Damar Shemuel halacha Rabbi Akiba. Damar mocher ba'ayin yafa mocher. Now, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak asks Rava, it seems that Rabbi Elazar, that we just analyzed, would not agree with Shemuel, his teacher, at his own teacher. How's that? Because Shemuel said halacha is like Rabbi Akiba. And Rabbi Akiba said that someone sells property, he sells in a generous way. So if I'm selling you a property, I'm selling you a path as well. If I'm selling you 3 trees, that includes the land underneath, and it should include also the pathway. But you see here, Rabbi Zerah just derived correctly, it seems, from Rabbi Elazar's opinion, that he would say that when there's 3 trees, then there's no path. Actually, Rabbi Elazar said that explicitly, right? When there's 3 trees, there's no path. So you see, he said explicitly, there's no path. And therefore, he seemed to disagree with his own teacher, Shemuel, that the halacha follows Rabbi Akiva, that someone who sells generously, and that would include the path. Amar le la mitukma matnitin kerebi Akiva. Mimai midekatane higdilu yeshape. V'i salka datach Rabbi Akiva hi amai yeshape ha'amar mocher be'ayin yafa mocher. Rava answers and says, actually, Rabbi Elazar himself agrees with his teacher Shemuel that halacha follows Rabbi Akiva, someone who sells generously. But when Rabbi Elazar came to this Mishnah, he could not figure out a way to explain this Mishnah in accordance with Rabbi Akiva. Why? Which part of the Mishnah bothered him? It's the part that says if you sell 3 trees and they grow and they're spreading shade on the owner's land, not right directly under the tree, but the rest of his land, then the owner of the land, that is the seller, is allowed to go and trim the trees so that their shade won't go on his land. Now, if you think that we follow Rabbi Akiva, then why should the seller have a right to trim the trees? Didn't Rabbi Akiva say that someone who sells generously, and that should mean if I sell you 3 trees, well, along with the land, then I'm selling you also the right of the shade of those trees on my land, and therefore I shouldn't be able to cut them down. But you see, the Mishnah says he is able to cut down those branches that are causing shade, and so therefore you see that our Mishnah is not the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, and that's why Rabbi Elazar had no choice but to say our Mishnah is not in accordance with Rabbi Akiva. However, Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak responds to that. Amar le emur da'amar Rabbi Akiva gabe bor vedut de la machshi ar'a gabe ilan mi shamat la le. So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak says, when did Rabbi Akiva say that someone who sells generously and is going to sell even a pathway and all that, that's only regarding a pit and a cistern that are in a field where selling him in a generous way is not going to weaken the land. So fine, so you get the pit and the cistern and you get the pathway, that's okay. But when it comes to a tree, did Rabbi Akiva ever say that it will apply to all the things related to a tree? Mila modeh Rabbi Akiva beilana notel letoch sedech abero shekoses melo mardea me'al gabe macharisha. Didn't Rabbi Akiva agree that if your tree is leaning over onto my property, and now I don't have room to work there, so I am allowed to go and cut the branches of your tree as high as an ox goad over a plow, meaning to the height of a farmer that's holding the ox goad, that stick, as high as it reaches. If he's holding it up, he can cut down all the trees, all the branches, so that he can have an easy passage. So you see, even Rabbi Akiva would agree that if I sell you in a generous way, fine, you can get a pathway and things like that don't bother, that don't cause any weakness to the land. But something that's going to cause me weakness, like if your branches are in the way of my plow, then I don't sell you that. I can cut that down. And the same thing will be true in this case for the shade that your trees are causing me. I sold you the trees and the land under the trees, but not the right to cause shade on my part of the land, and then my plants won't be able to grow. That I did not do. And so Rabbi Akiba could very well agree with our Mishnah that even though he sells in a generous way, nevertheless, he did not agree to also sell the rights to shade on his land. Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak thereby concludes that it was possible for Rabbi Elazar to explain our Mishnah in accordance with Rabbi Akiba and assume that, yes, the seller who sells the 3 trees to his friend gives him also a pathway. And since he gets the pathway, then he gets the surrounding tree, the surrounding area, enough for the gatherer and the basket as well. Rabbi Elazar rather chose to go against Rabbi Akiba. And this shows that, in fact, Rabbi Elazar is going against his teacher Shemuel, who said halacha is like Rabbi Akiba. Instead, Rabbi Elazar says someone who sells is in a stingy way and does not give the pathway. And so that's why he said, just like he doesn't give the pathway, so also he is not giving the area surrounding the tree. So that is Rabbi Elazar's opinion, but is not like Rabbi Akiba. Instead, that we have a machloket, and Rabbi Chia bar Abba would say he does get the area surrounding the tree, and presumably that would be like Rabbi Akiba. Now back to Rabbi Chia bar Abba. Tanya כבתי דרבי חייא בר אבא, הרי זה קנה תחתיהן וביניהן וחוסה להן, כמלוא עורה וסלו. We have a baraita that explicitly says halacha, that the same halacha as Rabbi חייא bar Abba, that someone who buys 3 trees, he acquires the ground underneath the tree and the ground beneath the trees, and he also has a perimeter beyond the area of the trees. How much? Enough for a gatherer of figs and of his basket. אמר לאביי לרב יוסף, אותן עורה וסלו, מי זורען? Abaye asked Rav Yosef, the space that's designated for the gatherer of the figs and his basket, who is allowed to sow there at other times? I mean, I understand at harvest time, the guy who bought the 3 trees and owns the land underneath and the land around, he has a right to use it. But all the rest of the year, who has a right to actually sow in the land, plant things there? Does the guy who owns the 3 trees totally own that perimeter area and he can even plant there? Or that means that he has a right to use that area in order to gather his figs, but the owner of the field, the rest of the field, he's the one that owns the right to use it the rest of the year. Amar le tinitu hachison zorea et haderech. Rav Yosef answers, we learned it in a Mishnah. The Mishnah later on, it talks about someone who owns an outer land and he sells to someone else the inner land that's totally surrounded by the outer land. And they agree upon a pathway. And so the inner guy, he has a pathway and he's allowed to come in and out to get to his inner garden. Now, who sows that pathway? And the Mishnah said that the guy who owns the outer land, he gets to sow the pathway. The guy in the inner can walk in and out, but the guy in the outer can sow it. And so this should be the same case. You have this area around that the guy who owns the 3 trees can use to gather figs, but otherwise, the owner of the surrounding field gets to sow in it. Isn't that right? Amar le midame Abaye challenges Rav Yosef and says, no, it's not the same. Hatam let lepeseda lalokeach, avalacha it lepeseda lalokeach. Amar le kaminatefi. In that case, just walking in a path in that Mishnah, there's no loss to the buyer. The buyer says to the seller is the guy who has the outside land, listen, if you want to plant things here, that's fine. I'm just going to walk on top of them, and if you're okay with that, no harm to me. And so the buyer has no loss in the matter. However, here there is a loss because the guy who owns the 3 trees inside can tell the person who owns the rest of the field outside, you are ruining my fruits, because when my figs, they fall down on their own, when they're ripe, they fall down, and they're going to fall onto your area that's all muddy here because you sowed it and watered it, and they're going to get all dirty and they're going to get ruined. I don't want that. It's bad for me. I want to keep keep this plain, nothing on it, so that when they fall, then they won't get ruined. And so it's not the same. And therefore, Abaye says that Abaye says that the outer guy cannot sow there. So does that mean the inner guy can? No, neither can. The continuation of that Mishnah on Daf 99 that we just quoted the beginning of, the continuation there is in a case where there's a mutual agreement. The outer guy says, listen, instead of taking a path straight through, it's going to cut through my field, it's going to be annoying. I'll give you a path that's roundabout, but I won't plant anything there. It'll be just your path. And the other guy agrees to that. So in that case, when there's a special designated path that both agree upon, that's only for use of the inner guy, then neither the inner guy nor the outer guy can plant anything there. And this case is the same as that. The guy who owns the rest of the field says, okay, your perimeter is yours to use so that you can gather figs. And the inner guy also agrees to that. He needs that in order to gather the figs. And this is the same thing. Neither of them can plant anything there. The outer guy, because that'll ruin the figs that dropped. And now if the inner guy plants there, well, that's the same reason why he didn't let the outer guy plant there, is because it'll ruin the figs that drop. So that the inner guy can't do it either. And so this is the opinion of Abaye, that nobody should be able to plant there. Tanya kevated Abaye, hareze kana tachtehen ubenehen v'chusalen kim lo ore v'salo ze v'ze enan l'shein lezorah. And there's a baraita that says explicitly, according to Abaye's opinion, says that someone who buys 3 trees, he buys all the land under the trees and the space between the trees and the perimeter around the trees, enough space for a gatherer and his basket. And neither the owner of the field nor the owner of the trees is allowed to sow in that area. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, Amen ve'amen.